Hello, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I wanted to make a quick video here responding to the debate that happened between Destiny and OnlyFans models and Lila Rose and Trent Horn. I don't know the OnlyFans model's name, so my bad. I had the name and then I forgot it. But I wanted to do a quick response in order to demonstrate a way of communicating the coherence of Christianity that starts with sort of overarching views of the world and shows how Christianity makes sense of our experience. Hopefully, this might be a model of how do we communicate the Christian view of sex to those who don't share that view. Now, before I start, make sure you like, subscribe. Feel free to subscribe to my Patreon if you wish. Support me by prayer. And if you have a suggestion for my light setup, I'm still trying to figure out this whole thing. Feel free to let me know. I am open, very open to suggestions here. And I'm going to invest in a Yeti microphone. I borrowed one from a friend, and that seemed to help with audio. I'm back to my old audio, so I apologize. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're going to dive right into this. And we have to ask, when asking a question like, why is sex work bad, right? We have to start, and I think Destiny in the dialogue was going to go here, and then the conversation got derailed with what is sex for? In other words, what is it doing? What is it for in this overarching world that we find ourselves in? There are two views of sex that stand diametrically opposed to each other. The secular view of sex runs something like this. Sex was an evolutionary development that evolved in order to enable us to propagate our genes to survive as a species. And that means the dynamics of sex are sort of ordered towards driving us towards reproduction. And so there are things like, it's not just sort of like hedonistic per se, like for pleasure. There are things like pair bonding that happen in sex with all of those aspects being ordered towards the survival of the species, propagating genes, things like that. The Christian view of sex is different. It's situated in a larger view of the world that starts with a creator who is in his very being this dynamism of love. He is the Father eternally begetting the Son in the Holy Spirit. I've done a video on the Trinity in my channel, so I encourage you to check that out. In God's being, in this dynamic movement of love in which the Father gives himself to the Son without reserve, the Son receives and returns all of that in the Holy Spirit, who is the bond of their movement towards each other. The world is created out of that overflow. The world is fitted to communicate the beauty of the divine life. So on the Christian view of things, when you see a star-speckled sky and you marvel at its beauty, you're not just saying that that's pretty. But the reason you feel touched by transcendence in that moment is because the transcendent God of the universe is communicating with you. Every material thing in the Christian view is a kind of sign. And as a good Anglican, we call this, in Anglican circles, a sacramental worldview. Now, in Anglican circles, we distinguish between the two sacraments of the church, those that are ordinarily necessary to salvation, baptism, and the Eucharist, or the two sacraments of the gospel, 5 of the church, which are things that you'd normally hear: confirmation, marriage, ordination, things like that, in high church Anglican circles. Now, regardless of that discussion, what we want to say about the world is that the world is sacramental. That is to say that the world is so created to be fitting mediators of the divine presence. Now, the difference in a sacrament is that God has promised to mediate his presence through material means, whereas in a sacramental world, things are created so as to be fitting mediators of the divine presence. The analogy I like to give is something like this. Suppose you hear the story of, let's say, a Holocaust survivor. So this happened when I was 10, and there was a Holocaust survivor who spoke to a group of my 5th grade classmates and I. And we had heard his story beforehand. That story colored my engagement with him. It sort of prepared me to receive him and provided a lens through which I was experiencing this Holocaust survivor right in front of me. The world is created to condition our experience of God. Now, the world is fallen, which means A, it's not a sacrament of God's presence, at least not yet. It will be in the eschaton at our Lord Jesus' return, but it's not yet a sacrament. And it's broken in some ways, in many, many, many ways. But nevertheless, it still retains its sacramental character, albeit through glass darkly in a sort of fractured way. In that context, sex is viewed as a kind of sign. So let's sort of unpack this role. What is the nature of sex in the Christian worldview? Well, whenever you're sort of communicating with people, whenever you're interacting with people, you're communicating with your body. And you might go to the grocery store and you might feel mad because someone gave you a funny look, right? And you don't exactly know why you're mad, but someone gave you a funny look and you are mad. And the reason for that is because maybe you interpreted that look as communicating something, right? We are communicating with our bodies, whether we know it or not. And the Christian explanation for this is that this is because you are a body-soul unity. So you might, if you've been in churches that are poorly catechized, you might hear this view that the goal is to die and go to heaven, to be with Jesus in a disembodied heavenly state. That is not Christian. That is Plato. That is Greek paganism. It's not Christian. On the Christian view of things, to be a human being is to be embodied. So your body is essential to your humanity. Now, it's true that you're more than your body. That's why you can survive death, but that's an unnatural state. I can survive with my arm chopped off, right? That doesn't make it good or natural. Rather, the natural state of the human being in biblical theology, the story of the Old and New Testament, is that you are radically embodied. And so your body, when someone slaps my face, they're slapping me because my person is extended in a bodily way in space and time. I don't just say, wow, you slapped my face. I can say you slapped me because I rightly identify with my body. Your bodies are always communicating. So what is it that you're saying in sex? Well, here's the claim. That in sex, you're saying to another person, I am wholly yours, you're wholly mine, and we are one. I belong to you, and you belong to me, and we are one. And the kind of belonging, that statement of belonging there, is this fundamentally deep kind of belonging, such that you are promising yourself to this person, we say for life. Not because you're sort of mechanistically thinking of a contract, but because of personally you are so drawing near to this person that in sex there are these emotions that can be articulated, that have been articulated by poets, by writing in literature, the kind of communication that says, I want to be with this person forever. There's a reason for that, why that foreverness springs out of the act of sex, and we use that language to describe the beauty of sex, of what happens in sex. Okay, so there's a difference now, we would say, between that kind of sex and what happens in sex work, or sex outside of marriage, or pornography, or all sorts of these things. So the Christian claim is that without the covenant, well, a covenant is a promise. The covenant of marriage is a promise that provides the context in which you're telling the truth to another person with your body. Without that context, without having promised yourself to that other person, you're telling them a lie. So think about this. Why is it so in Harry Met Sally, right? It's classic rom-com. They sleep together, whatever. Okay. So even in that, right, they're still fornicating. So it's still bad, and we'll get into why that's bad. But when Harry leaves, right, they have sex and he sort of leaves in the morning, right? She kind of feels betrayed. She wanted to cuddle, and she wanted to stay and like have breakfast and all this stuff. Like, why does she want to do that? We are saying as Christians, it's because with her body, whether she knew it or not, she is saying to Harry, and Harry said to her, I want to be with you. And so when he expresses something like, when he essentially commodifies her, when he essentially says, yeah, okay, that was a good one night stand, it was a good sexual release, right? She feels betrayed by that. Interestingly, you find this, right? When people have one night stands, often, not always, but often there's a kind of shame. Even if you're a secular person that dwells with that person, there's a kind of embarrassedness about this. And here was a point that I think Trent Horn made that was helpful, that was actually really good. Why is it? If you had two friends, or let's say you were becoming friends with someone, that friend said, okay, you know what? I want you to be my only friend, and I'm your only friend. If you have other friends, then you're gonna make me angry. We'd probably say, yeah, that you should avoid that friend. That's not a healthy friendship. But what if a sexual partner said to you, I want to be exclusive? We would not say that was unfitting. We would say, yeah, that's a healthy expression of sexuality. There's a difference between those kinds of relationships such that we recognize in sex there is at least a propriety in being exclusive. Now, that doesn't get you to normativity that you should only be exclusive, but we recognize that there's something about the act of sex and something about sexual intimacy such that there's a propriety in expecting exclusivity. It's a reasonable thing to expect in that relational context, whereas it's not a reasonable thing to expect in the relational context of just friendship. So what is it that differentiates sex? That's the key thing we want to hone in on. Now, that there are norms for sex is demonstrated in the fact that we can think of sex that is beautiful and good and sex that is ugly and bad. And I'm not just talking about non-consensual sex. Like everyone, the secularist who sort of has this libertarian view of sex agrees that rape is bad. Everyone, or grape, or whatever. YouTube, please don't shut this down. Okay, great. So everyone agrees that sexual assault, that those sorts of things are bad. Everyone agrees with that. Well, most people at least. So when I'm thinking about ugly sex, we're not just talking about non-consensual sex. You can think about the guy in his room who just masturbates to porn, or the people who have phone sex. There is something intuitive in the human heart that sees that as less beautiful than the even the 50-year-olds, right? We don't want to see what's happening with the 50-year-olds, but we recognize that that's beautiful. Like these 50-year-olds who have been married since, let's say, they were 20, and they're so passionately in love with each other at 50, and they're the kinds of couples that like, they tell you at 50, yeah, sex is a lot better now at 50 with my wife than it was when I was 20. Okay, so there's something amazing about that, right? There's something I don't want to see it, but there's something beautiful about that, right? There's something really good about that. What's the difference? We wouldn't call pornographic sex or BDSM or any of this stuff sex work. We wouldn't call that beautiful or good. Most of us would, even the secularist, most of the time, would not say that that's beautiful or good, even if it's a kind of release, okay? But there is sex that's beautiful and good. It's more beautiful and good. That's wholesome, in which two people fully give themselves to each other, and they're telling the truth to each other with their bodies. At least that's the claim. Now, Why is this sort of sex where two people give themselves to each other, it's only fitting in marriage? And that's the Christian claim. And I've given one argument for it, namely that the promise, the covenant of marriage, makes it truth telling. But there's another even deeper reason that takes a little bit more thinking. But remember what I said earlier. The world is meant to communicate who God is. Material things are signs of the divine presence. They're signs mediating and communicating reality about divine reality. So what is sex communicating about God? We'd claim that in a one flesh union, there's a kind of knitting together of souls that's happening in that act. Because again, we're not just material persons, we're soul body unities. There's this knitting together of persons that happens because there's a knitting together of bodies that happens, such that you're mirroring the story of Christ in the church. Now, that sounds strange to a lot of people, and a part of that I really think is because our cultural imagination really is sullied with porn, I think, sadly. And I'm speaking typologically. I'm saying it's a pointer to it. Now, there is an impropriety, of course, in imagining Christ as sort of like in this sort of carnal way having sex with the church. That's improper because that's to conflate the sign and the thing signified. It is to project the sign onto the thing signified and to reduce the thing signified solely to the sign. In sex, when two married people are giving themselves, a man and a woman are giving themselves to each other, and they're forming a one flesh unity, that is an echo of Christ fully giving himself, all that he is, to the church, and the church receiving and giving all that she is to Christ. Union with Christ is the deeper reality of which sex is only sort of a picture and a faint image and echo. So sex, on this view, it communicates more because the reality to which it points is more. In other words, it's deeper than just the physical act, whether you know it or not. Now, what happens without the covenant, whenever sex is had, is that you're distorting. It communicates a lie, we would say, because you're distorting Christ's likeness in marriage. You're distorting God in marriage whenever sex is had outside of marriage. Why is this? Well, remember, we are all, as images of God, we are all walking icons of God. We are all walking sort of communications of who God is. And so whenever we sin, we're lying in our bodies about him. We're distorting who he is to the world. If I steal something, right, then I'm acting as God's representative ontologically, all the way down in my being. And so when I steal something, I'm distorting what God thinks about that person's work, about the worthiness of commending that person's work, whoever I'm stealing from. When one has sex and commits sort of sexual acts outside of marriage, they are distorting the display of God in the world. That's the most fundamental reason why it's wrong on a Christian view of the world. Now, there's of course objectification. So like let's apply this to sex work, right? The real evil of sex work, the reason why, so like in the debate, you had conflicting studies brought up about, well, pornography has led to less abortions, it's led to more, or it's been coincident rather with more abortions. You've had, pornography has reduced STD, or has been coincident rather with the reduction of STDs. It's been coincident with the increase of STDs. All of those issues are kind of frankly irrelevant, right? Because you can have good outcomes doing a bad thing that's fundamentally destroying you, right? Like, let's say I I just drink, right? Let's say I just drink a ton, And, that might keep me, let's say I drink so much that I'm sedated. Now, normally, I'm just this horrible person outside, right? Outside of the world. So drinking so much that it sedates me destroys me just in a different ways, even though it might have other good consequences for society at large. It's kind of irrelevant to the issue. What we have to ask is, why is sex work? Why is sex outside of marriage? Why is that dehumanizing, i.e., why is that destructive to the kinds of creatures we are? If you're a secularist like Destiny, it sort of makes sense to say it isn't necessarily destructive. And it becomes sort of consistent with a kind of pure secularism, but here's the problem. Pure secularism doesn't work because there are elements in our human experience that testify against pure secularism that aren't a good fit with pure secularism. For instance, the fact that we can identify with Sally being betrayed. We can say, yeah, the kind of sex of a one night stand is not as beautiful as the sex that comes through sustained faithfulness. Most people get that. Most people get this idea that, that even if a guy and, some girl, they use each other for sex, but they're just they're friends with benefits. There's something intuitive about the fact that that's, even if you're a secularist who thinks that's illicit, that's a morally okay thing to do. I very rarely have met secularists who think that's just as good and just as beautiful as the couple who are faithful in this sort of endurant way. Okay, so one of the things Trent Horn did, I think, well, is he pointed out, he used this analogy of unfittingness to uncover this difference with sex, that there's something about sex such that we say, yeah, it's fitting for lovers to be exclusive with each other. It would be concerning if friends wanted to be exclusive with each other. So here's then the challenge to Destiny that I would say as a Christian. I would argue, whether you know it or not, whenever you have sex with someone, you're communicating with them. You're saying something to them with your body. And when you look at porn, you're actually conditioning your heart to view someone as less glorious than they actually are. Right? If I thought of my wife as there's this scene in Invincible, for those of you who have watched Invincible, the show, where Omni-Man, who's the Superman figure, but he's actually kind of evil, he says, yeah, I really thought of my wife as a pet. Right? He lives for centuries, and we all instantly recognize, okay, that's dehumanizing, right? That's offensive. Every time you have sex with someone outside of marriage, the reason there's this internal sort of friction created and this fragmentation in the self that happens, we would argue, is because you're brushing up against the fact that in sex, you were meant to actually dignify the other person as an image bearer. So when a man has sex with his wife, he is meant in his body to communicate to her, as Christ does the church, you are precious in my eyes. I love you, and I give myself to you, and I want your joy. When you treat a woman, men, when you treat women, when we have treated women as anything less, we've dehumanized them. When we fail to say with our sexual activity to one woman, you are precious, you are mine, I love you, and I delight to give myself to you, we both dehumanize ourselves because we fail to be an adequate ambassador of Christ, and we train our minds and our hearts to view women as less glorious than they actually are, namely walking communications of the glory of God, walking co-heirs who are telling the story of the beauty of God with us. Sex work is wrong fundamentally because it denies that truth about sex. It denies that sex is actually telling a bigger story, and it reduces the participants in sex, those who can have virtuous, holy sex, to things that are less than the glorious image bearers that are meant to reflect Christ than they are. That's the most central reason why sex work is wrong. The commodification of another person reduces them from the status of an image bearer. Now, Destiny would probably accept none of that. So, how do you adjudicate between those? Well, you start to sort of put your finger on intuitions, right? Secularism can come up with a self consistent view of sex, something that's sort of internally contained and abstractly self consistent. But you put your finger on certain aspects that then don't seem to fit with human experience, namely this this reality of feeling betrayed in when a sexual partner has sex with another person, or this propriety in asking. Even if you don't think it has to be this way, there's a propriety in asking a sexual partner to be exclusive. Why is that? What is it about sex that explains that? And we're giving a story that situates, that provides a context in which the sense that sex is meaningful and is meaning making, we're providing a context in which you can start to hear the kind of meaning that sex is making. Okay, so that's all for now. I might do a deeper dive if you guys want it. I hope this was helpful in some of your thinking. These are some of the off the cuff thoughts I have in reviewing that debate. Let me know what you think in the comments. Again, like, subscribe, share if this was helpful. Feel free, if you're not a Christian and you're coming to this channel, and even if you are, feel free to push back on me. I'm always interested in hearing your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. God bless.